Uzumaki Naruto, the hyperactive knucklehead ninja, was walking towards the lofty village walls of the Hidden Leaf Village, an unconscious Sasuke slung atop his shoulders. He was the last one of the retrieval squad sent to retrieve said Uchiha to return, and even though he was bleeding profusely while barely hanging on to his consciousness, he was grinning like an idiot. He had accomplished his mission, thereby fulfilling his promise. After all, Uzumaki Naruto never went back on his word, this time being no exception. As the gates to the village became visible to his glittering azure orbs, his injuries were finally cloaking their veils over him to the limits of his bodily endurance, prompting him to ultimately fall down on the ground with a thump, completely unconscious. Meanwhile, Temari was walking on the path leading to the Leaf Village, her ever-present battle fan was slung on her back like usual, and the white battle kimono she donned was draped to her curvaceous figure, held onto it firmly with a red bell tied to her waist in a knot. Her hair was trussed into her usual 4 ponytails, most found it unbecoming of a young female such as herself, mainly since it downplayed heavily on her looks. But to a kunoichi as serious as she was, it was a necessity. Looks didn't help you in battle, and they sure as hell never came in handy during shinobi affairs, she was taught that the hard way many times in the past. Her teal eyes caught 2 silhouettes lying there on the ground, unconscious, and she immediately rushed to them. Shikamaru had been taken by the medics ahead of her. In fact, the lazy genius had been adamant to get back to the village ahead of her as soon as he possibly could, and she could relate to his worries on that subject. Seeing her baby brother, who she hadn't ever even suffered so much as a scratch through almost all his younger life, lying half dead on the ground after his battle with Naruto, she had never felt so troubled as she had right then. So, in short, she could relate to the pineapple-haired genin, wanting to get close to his fallen squad mates as soon as humanly possible. Crouching down, she flipped over the Uchiha to make him face up. Her trained eyes instantly traveled and focused over the spiral-shaped wound scarring his chest. Even though the high-degree burns were clearly evident on his chest, she could discern with a mere glance that his wounds were in no way life-threatening. So, putting that thought to the side, she gently placed him aside and turned all her attention to the second victim lying by his side. She didn't even need to turn him to realize that he was on the verge of death, the blood pooling underneath him in a puddle was proof enough, staining the ground crimson. Instantly rushing to his side, she flipped him over and tore off her kimono near her thighs, right before pressing the bundled cloth over the gaping wound on his chest. She almost missed the shuffling footsteps coming nearer and nearer in her dazed state, but looking up to see the medic team now on site, relief washed over her entire being. Seeing them put Sasuke on a stretcher, she bristled. "Hey. Get over here, he needs immediate attention. His wounds are fatal," she shouted, quite frantically. Their eyes looked at her in mild surprise before traveling down to the boy on her lap. Instantly, much to her added anger and confusion, those eyes turned cold. "Uchiha-sama is injured, can't you see? Plus, he is much more valuable to the Leaf than he will ever be." She glowered over him, but the men didn't budge so much as an inch in their stances. "We have our orders and we must follow them to the point," they answered her curtly. Before she could so much as raise a word of protest, they were off to the village with an unconscious Sasuke now in tow. "Those idiots," she hissed. Looking down, her anger was replaced with worry, the blonde boy's condition seemed to be worsening each passing second. Her white clothes were drenching themselves in his blood, but she could care less about such trivial things right now. Cradling him up and placing him delicately over her back, she started jumping back to the Leaf, intent on getting him there herself now. But feeling her back now dripping in his elixir of life, her heart skipped a beat. "Hold on now you idiot, I'll get you help. Don't you die on me," she whispered worriedly, feeling his breaths turning fainter by the minute. Her feet started picking up their pace as branches started blurring beneath them in a daze. It seemed like hours before the foliage finally ended and she was rushing through the surprisingly unmanned gates of the village, straight to the hospital with a face of sheer urgency. Rushing in through the hospital doors, she slid to an abrupt stop. "I need help here." She spoke out loud, earning surprised looks from the staff going about their businesses there. Seeing the patient slung on her back, nurses started rushing close to her in a jiffy. "Please hurry up, he is in critical condition. This is an emergency." She pressed desperately, earning understanding nods from the nurse. "I understand that, miss," the nurse said reassuringly, now finally getting a good look at the bruised and beaten face of said patient. But catching a glimpse of those sun-kissed hair and whisker marks on his cheeks, even her eyes turned frosty. "I'll go and see if any doctor is free, please wait right here," she said. Her voice was all too calm now, a bit too calm for Temari's tastes in fact. Temari growled, helplessly watching her walk away without a care in the world. "What the hell's the matter with these people?" she growled, boring holes in the retreating nurse's back. Was she the only one who was seeing how serious Naruto truly was? Tsunade, in a coincidental turn of events, walked out from the operation theater housing an injured Chaoji, and just as her eyes landed on the blonde, the unconscious one, she dropped her clipboard with a gasp before rushing closer to him. What happened to him? Kami. Pulling her hands back with sheer will from trying to embrace the boy she adored so much, she had to crush her motherly instincts and started rushing back to an empty room in a hurry. Never mind that, bring him in the room over here. Temari didn't need to be told twice, she followed Tsunade just as swiftly. Shizune. Get over here, right now. Shouted Tsunade. Shizune came stumbling in, and seeing her brother in all but blood on the bed as if he was something the cat dragged in, her eyes widened in horror. Naruto. She gasped. Tsunade slapped her cheek gently, snapping her apprentice out from the shock. Assist me, don't fool around like this. We need to stabilize him, now. Hi. Shizune agreed, pulling up her latex gloves, intent on stabilizing him as soon as she possibly could. Temari stood there oddly, having no idea what to do now. She saw Shizune and Tsunade shouting orders in the air, moments before the room was frolicking with nurses, one of whom dragged her out and seated her in the waiting lounge, quite forcefully for her tastes. She sat there, waiting, covered head to toe in blood, with no idea what she was supposed to do or even where she currently was. Too engrossed was she in worrying for the boy who had essentially saved her little brother in more ways than one, but now, here he was, almost on the verge of death. And all for what, that prideful Uchiha? Her teeth clicked together in annoyance, ever since she had laid eyes on him, that prideful bastard had left a bitter taste in her mouth. But to outright abandon your village, the highest form of treason one could commit just to get some petty revenge, he had to have been ludicrous, or suicidal even, she just couldn't place her finger on which one it truly was. Temari. She had to wince and resist the urge to cover her ears, talk about being loud. What happened to you? And why aren't you being treated for that matter? This time she did cover her ears, the screech of the fabled banshee had finally succeeded in making her do so. Please Sakura, for Kami's sake, this is a hospital. Could you be any louder? She asked in barbed annoyance. Sakura nodded sheepishly, clearly embarrassed at being told off on her antics so bluntly. And this isn't my blood for your information, it's Naruto's. He was critically injured when I brought him in, and as far as I know, he's still being treated by Tsunade-sama herself. Sakura snorted, urging Temari to look up at her with an elevated eyebrow. Serves him right. Temari narrowed her eyes at that, her tongue curling in distaste. After I told him to bring back Sasuke to me, he injured and almost killed him. You should have left him there for all I care. How dare you even say that, you filth? Temari hissed. He had a gaping hole where his heart was supposed to be, and even after all that he was still trying to bring back that bastard of an Uchiha back to the village. You are his teammate, for fuck's sake, have some respect. She snarled lowly, like a lioness biting back her roar in mind of her surroundings. You don't know anything. Sakura snorted, huffing in disgust. My mom was right, after what he did to Sasuke, I know he is the demon the rumors claim him to be. He could just go somewhere and die for all I care. She was cut off before she could spout off any more venom. Leave. Temari whispered, her voice frigid as an iceberg. Before I make you, and in the process put you in the same ward as your precious Uchiha while I'm at it, allied villages be damned. She whispered, her tone ever the tempestuous one. Sakura shivered from the tone, knowing full well she was more than capable of carrying out said threat if need be. Plus, her own abilities were anything but confidence-inspiring. Fine. Stay here for the demon to wake up then, I couldn't care less. She huffed again and walked away, leaving an irate Tsunaeris behind. Taking deep breaths to calm herself down before she threw a tantrum, Temari sighed. Temari, what's wrong? Turning around with a start, Temari was met with a familiar pair of teal eyes, her eyes softened seeing them. What have you so riled up, sister? A monotonous voice asked. Everything's fine, Gaara, nothing for you to worry about. She assured him half-heartedly. Gaara nodded, knowing full well she was lying, but also knew that she must have had to have her own reasons for doing so, and left it at that. Temari was glad he didn't probe any further, even if the thought of ridding the face of the earth from the plague of one bubblegum-haired banshee was much too tempting. She decided that in the end, it just wasn't worth it. Then why are you covered in blood? He asked, as monotonous and stoic as ever. She looked down to herself, only now realizing how she was appearing to others around her. It's not my blood. Her answer made Gaara curious. Did his sister kill someone too? Improbable, not impossible, he thought. The idea was tempting though, it's Naruto's. He went stiff as a board hearing that. His eyes widened in disbelief. Is he alright? He asked. Even as cold as he was, even Temari could see the urgency in his eyes. Small wonder for her brother to act that way after what Naruto had done for him, she mused. She nodded in affirmative. Tsunade-sama is treating him at present. I heard from her his healing is inhumanely fast, and add to that her skills, she'll have him out of harm's way in no time. she assured him soothingly, and it worked. He nodded, trusting her enough on this. "We must head back to the village then," he said. Her heart skipped a beat for some odd reason. She didn't want to leave, not yet. "The village council has called back all shinobi we have at our disposal at once. They must take a decision on what the next course of action for our village will be." She wanted to argue, not knowing why, but in the end said nothing. She knew full well as to why they, or more specifically he, was being called back. The village was weak and distraught at the moment. So they must have their ultimate weapon at their disposal to show their strength in front of any and all who may think of taking advantage of soon as we can state right now. Even if she loathed it with all her heart, it was what it was. Nodding vehemently, she got up and walked out to head to the changing room. She needed to change her clothes with a spare she kept for such times after all, and even if a tiny part of her heart made her glance back again and again back to the operating room behind her, she trudged her way out without another word. Duties came first after all. 6 months later. A small civilian village in the land of wind. Walking down the barren streets in the scorching afternoon of this desert village was one Temari Sabaku. In her hands were a bundle of papers, some supply orders she was assigned to get signed by one of their merchant traders. Letting her eyes trail up to the sky while covering them with her hand for a failed attempt at shading them, she sighed. "I'm hungry," she whined. It was nearly lunchtime, and apart from some water in the morning, she was apparently running on fumes by now. "I need something to eat, and I need it now." Those damned merchants did negotiate hellishly if she were to be honest, but she wasn't so inept as to give in to their demands without slicing her way through it. Stopping outside a shop with a start, she saw a familiar crown of golden tresses clad in an orange jumpsuit hauling crates here and there. She smiled, almost going in to go and slap his back in a happy greeting. Almost. There was certainly something odd about him, to say the least. Now that she looked a bit closely, his clothes were stitched in several places, and on top of that, they were tattered even more. They were barely even passable for a wage-working civilian laborer, much less a full-fledged shinobi. Bread coiled in her heart like a snake, there was a feeling of melancholy around him. But the thing eating away most at her heart was the one object she couldn't quite see on his person. His headband. Walking behind a corner to an alley, she kept an eye on him from afar, her hunger lay all but forgotten now. She saw her going up to the merchant, retrieving some coins, which she surmised as payment for his services. As little as it was all she could make of it at present. He walked out into the roads, she followed him, still from afar. He stopped at a raiment stand, and for the life of her, she couldn't help the fond smile that lit up her face. That boy could inhale ramen, that much she knew from the time she had spent scouting out the details of all the participating genins 7 months ago. But for some reason or another, he was just staring at it with a faraway look, as if he were troubled. But much to her shock, he walked away from it without so much as a back glance. Even if she wasn't sure of her scouting memories during her time from the exams, she was pretty damn sure that hearing of his legendary thirst for ramen broth was something else. It had been the talk of the village at that time, apparently. He never, and she did mean never, walk away from a ramen stand even if he was dying, that was absolute. But she digressed, for now at least, and watched him walk up to a fruit stand to buy 2 pomegranates. Then he walked into a store and came out with a sealed bottle of water in hand. She followed him from the rooftops, taking extreme care to not be seen by anyone around her, especially him. Following him into an empty alley, she sighed in relief at how surprisingly shady and cold it was, much to her relief, and watched intently as he leaned against a wall to his back and slid down tiredly. She watched him bite hungrily into his fruit and gulp down half his water bottle afterwards. Sitting still for a few minutes, she eventually saw him lie down and usher into sleep. Deciding she had seen enough already, she walked up to him and shook him awake. Waiting for him to gather his senses, she took this time to run a closer inspection on him while she was at it. Now that she was within arm's length to him, she could see no traces of baby fat that once sat proudly on his cheeks the last time she had laid eyes on him. But seeing his half-lidded baby blue eyes eyeing her in honest confusion, she frowned. "Who are you?" he muttered sleepily. She frowned even deeper and said nothing, letting him see her even closely. But even after a minute, much to her growing ire, he was eyeing her the same way. "I'm sorry miss, can I help you?" he asked again. Her frown deepened into a full-blown scowl, more so from his lack of energy than his memory gap, the latter only hurt her a bit for some odd reason. She crossed her arms over her knees. "Naruto, it's me Temari. Don't you remember me, even a little?" she asked. He looked at her oddly, as if she were funny. Tilting his head to the side, quite cutely in her honest opinion, he went to shake his head before realization dawned over him. "Ah," he gasped. "You're Gaara's, right?" he asked. She nodded, smiling. "It's been a long time." "But it has." She agreed. She was about to question him a bit more when, much to her embarrassment, her stomach grumbled loudly. In a snap, a pomegranate was in front of her face with its bearer extending his hand to her innocently. "Take it, you seem hungry," he said in an unusually small voice, she noted. She blushed, taking it from him gratefully. "Thank you." She whispered, biting into it without another thought. She went past the fruit in what seemed like seconds to her. Naruto handed her his half-filled bottle which she accepted with a grateful nod. "So Naruto?" she asked. He perked up. "What are you doing here all alone? Out on a mission or something?" she asked. He looked down, suddenly finding his lap much too interesting and shook his head. "I'm not a shinobi anymore, Temari. I was banished from the village 6 months ago," he whispered, his voice downtrodden. It felt as if someone had dropped a house on her heart. She couldn't believe her ears. What?" she asked incredulously, almost believing he was joking. "Right." He hadn't noticed her question it seemed and went on, undeterred. "They banished me from the village 6 months ago after the retrieval mission we did to bring back Sasuke. I guess you didn't hear about it, huh?" he asked. She shook her head in denial. "I'm barred from entering the Land of Fire or any of its allied countries including Wave and Spring, or will face immediate execution for breaking said laws," he whispered, as if he were daydreaming. To say Temari was shocked was an understatement. "Then what are you doing out here, Naruto?" she asked. "Why not join some other village or something?" He chuckled a hollow laugh, devoid of all humor. It made hair rise on her neck for some odd reason. "Iwa and all their allied villages are still resentful of Konoha. They would rather see me dead than take me in," he replied, and she could see sense in that assessment. "If they somehow found out about me being would rather extract the Kyuubi into one of their own loyal shinobi, killing me in the process to increase their own strengths. Kiri is still in a civil war, so they too want some of their own for their own reasons. And the smaller villages won't even look at me straight. It causes unrest among major villages if some minor village hosts the most powerful of the 9. A small streak of water lined her eyelashes. "Then how have you been getting by, Naruto? What are you doing here?" she asked. He smiled and looked down at his lap, unknowingly causing his hair to foreshadow his eyes. "By going to ask help from minor villages, I caused word to spread around that is roaming free and up for the taking. The Akatsuki was already after me, so I came here one day and went into hiding. I don't use any chakra or techniques here to risk getting sniffed out. The merchants here give me some work every now and then. They are not permanent, just some odd jobs here and there. No one wants a boy with a shady background like me around them for any longer than what is absolutely necessary, I guess. I make 50 or even 100 ryo 2 or 3 times a week. It isn't much, but I make do by cutting some meals here and there. Us ninja are trained to survive anyways, and I've been surviving since I was born, so it's fine." He smiled, small drops now streaking down his nose onto his lap. Her own eyes watered, she was barely holding back a choke of her own. "Then why did you give me your fruit and water?" she whispered, still not understanding anything at all, even if she could make complete sense out of it. He smiled at her, flicking his head sideways to cause glistering drops flick aside from his eyes. "I know what being hungry feels like, plus, you're a friend. No one deserves to starve for any reason, no matter who it is." That was all he could say before her slender arms were encircled tightly around his neck. She hugged him. To think he had offered her his food without a second thought when he never had enough for himself, just. How? Naruto stiffened for a moment. He hadn't been hugged like this for years now. Ever since the third Hokage had stopped seeing him as a child, only Tsunade had gone and hugged him. But his own will wavered. He hugged her back shakily. "Let it out." Her small whisper was all it took to make him shrink in on himself and hide himself in her arms. Finally, the great dam holding back his heart broke. He hadn't cried when his friends and teachers had reprimanded him for raising a lethal hand against Sasuke, the same person he was supposed to retrieve back safely. He hadn't cried when Sakura, the girl his heart always skipped a beat for, had told him to his face that it was good that the village was finally ridding itself of the demon that had plagued them for more than a decade now, and he just might even do the world a favor and die. But today was different. The affection behind the hug had made his will waver. It wasn't grandfatherly like Hiruzen used to give him, it wasn't motherly like Tsunade used to glump him. It was different. And he loved it. It had shattered his iron-strong barriers like glass. He trembled at his own weaknesses now being up for the world to see, or his hopelessness now emitting out of him in spades. He did not know. He hated to do it, but he wanted to let it out. It had been so long. So long. Temari held his trembling form for what seemed like hours before he finally fell unconscious. From trembling, crying, hunger or tiredness. She did not know. All she knew was that he had needed to let it out, and she was glad it was her shoulder he had trusted to do it on. Lifting him up the same as she had done months ago, she instantly noticed the lack of weight bearing down on her from last time. He was featherlight, even lighter than her. She checked into a local inn, placed him on a bed, and ordered some ramen from the attendant on his way out. Zipping down the fastener holding his jacket close, she took it off of him gently, being extra careful not to wake him up by accident when he finally looked so peacefully happy. His body showed heavy signs of malnutrition, bone lines were evident everywhere on his torso, but the muscles on his arms were still ripped much to her surprise. Was it from regular odd jobs without chakra enhancements or plain old buff from demonic chakra coursing in his veins to help him survive his ordeals? She did not know, neither did she want to. She shook him awake after an hour when the lunch finally came and sat by his side. Naruto groggily opened his eyes, feeling a soothing hand brushing his hair lovingly and teal-green eyes looking down at him in what seemed to be in pure adoration. "Temari?" he asked. Sitting up, he looked around and regained his bearings, only to grow even more confused seeing his unusual surroundings. Why was he in the room? Was she here to capture him too? Suddenly, a steaming bowl of ramen was pushed onto his lap, courtesy of a fondly smiling Temari. "Eat up," she said. He perked up in surprise. "I took your lunch, so it's only fair if I pay you back, right?" she asked coyly. He looked at her, his eyes flashing innocent confusion. She folded a pair of chopsticks into his hands and gave them a squeeze of assurance. "Eat," she whispered softly. He was hesitant, after all it was just not right to take a full meal in exchange for a single fruit, was it? But he had no idea when he might chance upon such an offer next time. "So, thank you," he whispered and dug in, being extra careful not to spill or waste any noodly goodness whatsoever. Temari sat there, her cheek plump in her palm as she watched him eat with gentle eyes. Quite honestly, she was saddened at the look in his eyes, it almost seemed as if that bowl was the most precious thing to him in the world right now, but what burned her the most was that she was right. And she knew it. He finished the bowl in no more than a minute, she could see he was still hungry as she had expected him to be, and pushed a new steaming bowl onto his lap. "Go on," she said. He nodded, almost going in for another bite before he stopped and looked at the bowl warily. "Is it poisoned?" he asked. She frowned, not at the small voice he talked in, or even the suspicion he had just forced over her, but from the point that he didn't even seem the least bit concerned over what she was about to answer him. "No," she whispered honestly, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "It isn't poison, Naruto, trust me." He nodded, not meeting her eyes in the least. Her soft voice made his heart twist strangely, and he didn't like it, not one bit. She handed him a glass of water, one that he drank slowly before she wiped off his face with a tissue, as if he were the child and she the mother. Involuntarily, a soft yawn snaked past his lips, his eyes drooping from being lounged on such a comfortable bed after sleeping his days away on the rock-hard ground for months on end. Always having to keep your eyes and ears peeled for thugs on the streets, or worse, the people after him. Wasn't a thought that was currently present in his mind either. He was just tired. The hand gently pushed down his chest, forcing him to lay down his head on the pillow when a soft sensation ran over his forehead. "Sleep now, you need the rest. You're tired, right?" a cooing whisper told him. His lidded eyes looked unsure, but the weakness of months and the quiet comfort of bed finally overtook his vigilante senses. The safety of a place away from the harsh weathers of deserts with a roof on top to cover his head made him doze off almost instantly. But what finally did him in was the soft velvet-like hand that was rubbing his sensitive whiskers so tenderly. In a turn of surprise she hadn't expected, like an infant kitten, Naruto curled up into her arms and snuggled himself to sleep. "Idiot," she giggled. Leaning down on her elbow, her eyes just fondly watched him sleep in her chest like a baby, his soft purrs lulling her own eyes to sleep mere moments later. Naruto woke up, feeling quite possibly the best he could remember as far as his memory served him, only to see Temari cuddled up by his side. Her head was on his chest, both her arms hugging him like a bear, while his own arm was wrapped protectively across her waist. He shook her gently. "Temari, wake up." Her teal eyes opened, realizing her compromising position, she blinked. "Naruto?" she asked. He nodded. Had it been anyone else, absolutely anyone else, she would have beaten them senseless while yelling obscenities. But seeing his eyes looking so honestly confused, even more so than her own, it made even her sleepy and extremely volatile senses melt. She sat up and rubbed her eyes off their sleep. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, it was unconscious, you know," Naruto mumbled. She nodded, already figuring as much. "I know." He nodded back while she yawned sleepily. "Plus, I have a habit of cuddling up to the soft toys I have in my room, so I guess I am to blame," she whispered. Realization struck her, horror overtook her entire being, and she jerked awake in disbelief, almost not believing what she had just unraveled to another person who wasn't her sibling. She looked at Naruto and blushed, half expecting him to outright laugh or make fun of her. Instead, Naruto just got up in an uncaring fashion and went to retrieve his jacket from the hanger. "I'm sorry I bothered you so much. I must take my leave now, thank you for the hospitality, Temari." He thanked her. She caught his wrist and pulled him back by her side, he eyed her in confusion. "Don't go," she told him. "Stay with me tonight. There's enough room for the both of us, see?" she asked, motioning her arms around the room extravagantly. Naruto fiddled uncomfortably, he wanted to, Kami knew he wanted to. But was it safe for him, can I trust her? He thought. But seeing her eyes looking at him in nothing but warmth and concern, his doubts vanished. I have nothing to lose anyways, even if it's a trap. He thought. He was much too tired already of life itself, committing seppuku in a few days had been his plan all along, so what was there to fear now anyways? Even if it was a trap, why not just stay here with her in his last moments? Although it might have been fake, some care and concern in his last moments would be nice, right alright. He agreed, and she beamed with a happy nod. "Are you hungry, then?" she asked, and got yet another shy nod. She got up to go out and order for room service before turning around for a moment. "Naruto." She garnered his attention. "Go and take a shower while I come back, there's some robes from the inn inside, so you can use them for the time being." He nodded, and she went out. Walking into the bathroom, he undressed and started working on washing his clothes. It was a force of habit he had from his childhood, looks like it might die with him, right? The idea itself was laughable, at least to him. Plus, water in the land of wind had always been quite scarce to begin with, so it was only natural that he had retained this habit, he supposed. But walking into the cold shower, it felt heavenly he had to admit. The soap started lathering away as grime and sand started accumulating down his feet. His hair, still normal length since he sliced them regularly with a kunai, more so to resist the scorching heat in the desert than keep them kempt, his skin shone once more like it had for years in the past. Walking out, he was greeted with a fondly smiling Temari. He looked so much better now. She mused inwardly. Gesturing her hand to the table, both sat on the dining table filled to the brim with food. Filling up a plate with ample amounts of rice before drizzling it with an extra load of curry, Temari gladly handed it to the gratefully nodding boy. Both ate in silence, Temari to gather up her mind, while Naruto was much too interested in the food offered to notice her expressions. The attendant came and took the utensils away, leaving behind a couple of blondes shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Temari had no idea how to engage in a conversation with him, while Naruto himself had no idea what to say. He had scarcely had anyone to talk to for quite some time, and even if he had, she was a kunoichi while he was no longer a ninja anymore. He had no idea what to say, so he kept silent. Finally, Temari sighed. "Naruto." She kept a hand on his lap to calm the surprised boy down. "Can I ask you something?" she asked softly. He nodded, not seeing any problems with it. "Anything, Temari, I don't have anything to hide, you know," he replied earnestly. She smiled, patting his thigh reassuringly. "What exactly happened after I left you at the hospital that day? Tell me everything." And so his tale began. Flashback. The esteemed chambers in the Hokage Tower housing the council governing the village, Tsunade tapped her index finger impatiently on the table. Unknown to herself, splinters rose and fell as her nail ground out the wood itself from the inhumane taps she was making on the timber. Even as masked as her veteran gaze was, she had a feeling of foreboding about this. An urgent meeting with these old coots was never a good thing, especially if the smirks that threatened to cover their faces were anything to go by. Beharu, being the most influential one here, decided to start the proceedings. "Hokage-sama, we called this meeting to inspect the reports handed in by all squadmates sent to retrieve Uchiha Sasuke. Especially the reports concerning Uzumaki Naruto." She started. Bile rose in her throat, this wasn't looking good, "I'm sorry, but with my medical duties, I haven't had a chance to go over those reports. Even still, what did you wish to discuss?" She suppressed her fears and masked her poker face on. Genin Uzumaki used 2 taels worth of demonic chakra of the 9-tailed fox, and lost control over it to the point of almost killing Uchiha-sama, the victim he was sent to retrieve, his teammate and by proxy a leaf shinobi, all because he wanted to show him who the best among them was. Beharu finished. Tsunade's eyes were downright murderous, "I've seen both their injuries, and let me tell you Naruto's injuries were far more grave than what that Uchiha had. How can you claim he lost control just like that, where is the proof?" she retorted. In a surprising turn of events, that could be attributed to the inherent skills and genius of the Uchiha, no? Asked Danzo. He aced the academy, possessed the revered Sharingan, and fully matured it in battle with Uzumaki. Had it been anybody else? He left the threat hanging, murmurs reverberated around the quiet chambers like buzzing bees, Tsunade. Homura fixed his glasses wisely. "The council has deemed the boy an advent threat that must be suppressed, now," he explained. Seeing almost no rebuttal, instead a handful of smiles, Tsunade bristled, "He is no threat. We do not have the Mokuton anymore, neither do we possess the knowledge and sealing abilities of our past 3 Hokages either. Do you truly believe you could suppress the full might of the Nine Tails all on your own if need be, Tsunade? Asked Danzo. Tsunade glared, but said nothing. As much as she loathed to admit it, that damned cripple was right, even still. She protested. Gen and Uzumaki will be banished, that is the decision of the council, Tsunade. Kaharu cut her off. Tsunade, having had finally enough, slammed her hand down on the table with a bang. You make no decisions, fools. She roared. I am the Hokage. Her declaration had absolutely no effect on them, instead they seemed amused. That may be so, but this. Homura threw a scroll on the table, unfurling it in front of her. The official seal of the daimyo made Tsunade's eyes go wide. Makes your say on the matter useless. He finished victoriously. Tsunade, barely restraining herself from lashing out and snapping some necks, glared at them. Especially Danzo, you too Danzo? She asked, her voice incredulous and disbelieving. No one knows more than you how much we need him. She pleaded. The man shifted uncomfortably, she thought she had struck a chord, be that as it may, a weapon ticking to blow up in our faces is worse than having no weapon at all. We haven't used that resource any time in the past, history serves us well. He finished stoically. The council and the daimyo himself have deemed Uzumaki a threat to the village. The decision is unanimous, there is nothing you can do. Do not let personal feelings take over Tsunade, this was precisely why the Nidaime laid down such laws. As much as loved the deceased man, she cursed her granduncle inwardly. The seal is weakening, we will extinguish the threat before it ever comes to be. You have till dawn to let him know, or we will do it for you. That is all we can give you Tsunade, the council may be dismissed. All elders, shinobi council members and civilian leaders got up to leave. Tsunade's eyes watered, she gripped a parchment in her hands in an iron grip. She felt so helpless that she hated herself for it, remember this day well. She whispered. Each one of them stopped for a moment before walking away, leaving a sobbing Tsunade behind them. Konoha Hospital. Like shining fingers, sun rays peered through the open windows and lit awake the dank white walls with their luster. The gentle click of the door and slight shuffling of footsteps breathed a new life in the silent space. Groggily blinking his eyes open, Naruto yawned. Though laying first glance at his visitor, he grinned, hey Saku. Slap. Craning his neck around, eyes wide in disbelief, what was that for? He asked. Tilting his head aside, he couldn't quite comprehend the furious expression over his crush's face or why it was there in the first place. I brought Sasuke back like I promised, didn't I? He asked again. Why did you slap me? Brought him back, you say? She hissed. He flinched back on instinct, almost raising his arm up in self-defense as he sat on guard. I asked you to bring him back to me, not kill him in the process, you idiot. She snarled. He sat there, stunned. Naruto himself knew Sasuke couldn't be dead, he had made sure not to land any fatal blows, no matter what it caused him in the end, but did she not see the condition he was in when he came back? Or right now, for that matter. My mother and the rest of the village were right. Blinking in confusion, the stump boy couldn't even make sense out of this conversation right now. You really are a demon. His wounds didn't hurt him as much as her screech, her words in particular, had hurt him. It was one thing to hear it from strangers he didn't know, but to hear it from the girl he adored. Don't worry anymore, my mother is on the council. You be damn sure that she'd make sure to have you levied the highest punishment possible, banishment at the very least. How dare you hurt my Sasuke-kun, you damn demon filth. His eyes were clouded by the time her screeches halted, he couldn't even see her leave the room other than the audible click his door made. He hadn't expected that, and after hearing that venom from her mouth, he honestly felt betrayed. The same thing happened all over again with Ino, she too came to threaten him all the same, by naming her father's influential position he was well aware of himself. Shikamaru too, had come to reprimand him on almost causing their rescued heir to die, thereby making all their life-endangering attempts almost negated. Kakashi had come in to wisely teach him how he should have tried to talk it out with his friends, but more so how ashamed he was that he had openly made the first direct contact on his teammate with a technique as dangerous as the Rasengan. But the cherry on top had been Jiraiya, going so far as to absolving his Toad contract and by effect his apprenticeship for shaming him by raising a killing attack on his comrade with a technique taught to him by the sage himself. Sasuke had certainly gone through great lengths at concocting this makeshift story, he had concluded, but the delusions his so-called friends had accepted without a grain of salt were the ones that truly baffled him to no end. Next morning. Hokage office. A warm cup of sake lay filled on her table, but for the life of her, Senjutsu Nada had not the courage to muster up and gulp it down her throat. She had called for her Anbu to retrieve Naruto, and guilt and regret were already gnawing away at her heart like lead stakes. The puff of smoke later, standing there with all the conjured-up confusion of the word was one orange jumpsuit-clad, blonde-haired genin, Aba-chan. He whispered, utterly confused. Why did you call me out so early? I'm still tired from my injuries, you know, can't this wait till tomorrow? Seeing the innocence still lingering in those azure orbs, she all but muted out his adorable voice her heart couldn't get enough of. Stealing herself, Genin Uzumaki Naruto, registration ID 17782. She said. Naruto straightened up, knowing what protocol had just been initiated with those words. This particular introduction was only used by the village leader in case a matter of utmost importance rose up. One that went as far as to delve out these guarded details known to no one but the cage and their shinobi themselves. Hi. He said, his voice serious and lacking of all its usual chirp. Genin Uzumaki Naruto. With a sharp intake of breath, she started. You are hereby stripped of your shinobi status and hereby banished from the village hidden in the leaves for an undisclosed time. But why? He whispered. On the grounds of losing control over a power you had no control over and effectively using said power to almost kill and or cripple a ninja you were sent to retrieve unharmed. You have been deemed a threat to the Leaf and by the order of the Fire Lord himself banished, effective immediately. His eyes welled up in unshed tears, the air itself felt thick and melancholic. You may not enter the land of fire or any of its allied nations, the Spring and Wave included, lest you be executed without pending trial. By the powers bestowed upon me by the village laws, please hand over your headband. She pushed her hand forth, not meeting his broken gaze in the slightest. His hand shakily rose up and pulled out the object from his pocket, brushing it with his thumb for a lasting moment, while memories of how he had achieved it flashed through his eyes. He placed it on the desk along with another object that made Tsunade's heart shatter in a million pieces. I won't be needing this anymore either, Tsunade-sama. Pulling back his mask to hide his emotions, the necklace he had won fair and square was returned to its owner with a sad smile. Hearing him call her so formally had been the last straw. Tsunade broke down into a heap of sobbing mess. When do I leave, Tsunade-sama? He asked, voice hollow as an empty shell of paper. 2 hours. You have 2. She told him, her voice cracking in choked sobs. Her trembling hands cradled the 2 objects as if they were her own heart, which wasn't further away from the truth as one might expect. I'll be taking my leave then. He stated. Her eyes went wide. Wait, Naruto. She blurted out, he eyed her vehemently. Pulling out an old wooden parchment out from her drawer, she handed him the antiquity-looking scroll shakily. Sarutobi-sensei was supposed to hand this over either when you turned 16 or became it. After his demise, I was entrusted to the task. She told him, watching in slight envy how his eyes glazed over in fondness hearing that name. It is supposed to contain your parents' legacy. No one can open it besides you, it is linked to your blood and chakra specifically. She couldn't say no more for it was all Naruto could hear before he had snatched it off her palms like a starved predator. You knew them? He asked her. She shook her head, almost shivering how icy his voice had been. No one but Sarutobi-sensei knew of them, he took that information to the grave. That scroll is the last piece we have of their legacy. She admitted. He nodded, clutching the scroll as if it might slip out any moment now. Clouded hazelnut orbs watched him walk out in pure anguish, all lost to herself and the portraits hanging staring down on her from the wall. His feet took him home, eyes as lifeless as the Reaper. Naruto stared at the walls of his apartment with nothing but emptiness. I demon. For the Yonde Michiha. In the end though, he smiled, I guess it was for the better. His words lacked any conviction or even life in general. Before even stepping in, he knew what to expect when the door to his home was unlocked. It was already broken in. Anything of value was stolen, not that there was much of it in the first place, well the rest was demolished in some way or the other. He worked his way around the trashed room, swiping off the trash from the floor to lift up a tatami mat, one he had burrowed in thoroughly for these kinds of emergencies in particular, and retrieved out a couple pairs of clothes and supplies. Leaving the house, not before glancing longingly at the Hokage monument clear in view from his balcony, he made his way to the gates, only to stop dead seeing the last person on earth he wanted to see right now. Uchiha Sasuke. Oh. He greeted in distaste. Naruto didn't say anything, he breezed past him wordlessly, as if he were a mere obstacle in his path. Something Sasuke did not take lightly, now do you see what you get for trying to deny an Uchiha loser? He snarled. Naruto stopped for a moment too long, inching to retort, but in the end, he walked away without a word. There really was no weight to his words now, was there? You are lucky to be left alive after what you did to your best friend, demon. Maybe the gods above may have seen your diabolical actions and may even enact their judgment on you. A voice he had once adored screeched from behind him. Even as rigid as Naruto willed his heart to be, that one stung. With each step he took away from the village, a piece of his dreams and life died in blissful harmony. End of flashback. And that was when I started my lone journey out in the world before eventually settling here at last. The way you see me earlier is probably what I've lived like since the time I first came here. He told her. She had no words, her eyes looked at him with such love and affection that it made him feel a bit queasy. It was so confusing. If you have any plans to use or even kill me, then you may as well tell me. I promise I won't resist. This snapped her out of her daze. What? She asked incredulously. He smiled softly, closing his eyes in a vain attempt to hide their mistiness. Just let me have a few days of rest, if you can, then I'll come peacefully wherever you want me to. As I said, I won't resist. I was already planning on killing myself in a few days regardless, so if I can be of some use to you, maybe it will have some meaning. Naruto could say no more, his voice cracked and choked. Temari sat frozen in her spot, unable to conjure up a single coherent thought. Disgusted was she with herself that she even had anything to do with that spit hell had spat down on earth, one those bastards called a hidden village, but it was solidified even more so for her that she was even considering on the offer one of those worms had made to ask her out on a date. That damned lazy ass was one of them too, no matter who or how he may be, and that twisted her mind in ways she absolutely did not desire. But nothing vengeful could make her tear her eyes away from those endless pools of anguish she was presently staring into, those azure orbs looked so broken and lost. They lacked any of their usual shine or luster, and it all demented her to think that he really did have nothing to live for. She opened her arms a little, motioning for him to come to her. He hesitated, but saw nothing other than warmth and understanding in those teal eyes of hers. On instincts he fell forward, willing himself in her arms for anything she may want. It frightened Temari to her core since she knew this boy never lied, a fact that was laughable for a shinobi, even though it made him all the more special in her eyes, so he was only telling the truth about ending his own life. Tears streamed down her cheeks, she sniffled and buried his head in her chest tightly. Her chin resting on his head, she held his shivering form with a sad smile. She really was glad he was letting down all his barriers for her. I won't ever dream of hurting you, Naruto. She softly consoled him, it only served his wails to get louder and louder. She tried to kiss his head. Okay, trust me when I say this, I'll make it all better. Do you trust me, Naruto? He only nodded, too engrossed was he in absorbing all this affection she was showering him in. It was the only thing he craved for, not money, not luxury, not even food or attention, all that his body craved now was love. He snuggled in her arms, eliciting a giggle from the girl who was more than happy to let him be comfortable and calm himself down. She did not know how long she held him before his cries eventually died down into sleepy little purrs. His body needed all the rest it could get after all those months of strain, she knew that it had to have endured so much just for the primal need of survival. A week could take its toll on a ninja, a month or two was what veterans were hired for, he had endured this hell for almost a year. She pulled him down with her under the sheets, and just for that moment, in her tight embrace, she hid him from the entire world. Trust me, Naruto, I'll make it alright. At around 2 o'clock in the morning. Temari was sleeping in her bed as she felt the bed beside her feel empty, and her eyes snapped open as she saw the door to the balcony open and the breeze flowing the curtain inwards as she immediately got out of bed, thinking her sun-kissed blonde-haired friend had run off as she stepped into the balcony to see him sitting on the balcony railing reading a letter in the moonlight as she stepped up and sat beside him. He turned to her, giving her a small apologetic smile. I'm sorry I woke you up. He apologized softly and she smiled at him gently and shook her head. No, I was just worried where you went. So what are you doing out here in the cold? The breeze is quite cold tonight, she said, wrapping up the bed sheet that she brought with her a little over his shoulder too. He thanked her and she scooted closer to him as their arms touched a bit and she stopped as her gaze turned to the letter he was reading. So who's that letter you're reading? She asked curiously and he glanced at the letter in his hand sadly and answered. It's from my parents. The only thing I ever knew that they said to me. Their last words, I read it every night for the past 6 months, since there was no one to talk to I just made it a connection to my parents. He said and she smiled as she put an arm around his waist and scooted closer to him. They must have been great people. She whispered and he nodded with a small smile as he too wrapped his arm around her unconsciously and rolled up the scroll sealing it as both sat in the moonlight gazing at the moon. Temari, why are you being so nice to me? What do you want? He asked in a vulnerable tone and she put her head on his shoulder, snuggling into the warmth away from the cold breeze. I want to help you, Naruto, just as you helped me. She whispered and he was confused and she sensed his confusion as she spoke. That time when you fought Gaara in the forest I thought I was done for as no one who has ever faced my brother in a full possession has ever survived except my father who had the reverence of the third Kazekage to subdue him. But then you came kicking him away and proceeded to do things that I had never imagined possible. You took down Gaara at his best and saved the lives of most of your village and mine. And even then you had mercy on Gaara as you knew the pain he endured and you changed him. She whispered and he rubbed her arm to make her a bit warmer and pulled her closer as she snuggled and clutched the bedsheet tightly, enjoying how warm he felt. You don't know how much you have changed Gaara. He no longer kills anyone unnecessarily and suppresses his urges. The villagers and shinobi were still wary of him at first, but over the months they saw how he didn't kill anyone and always helped his teammates on missions, and they started respecting him. Ever since he fought you, he has been the little brother that I always wanted. You don't know how much it means to me. She whispered the last part with a hiccup as Naruto rubbed her arm, soothing her. He was surprised that he had changed Gaara so much and was happy that his friend now had the respect of his village unlike him. He smiled a sad smile. He wished his village too had at the very least tolerated his existence if not acknowledge him. I'm glad I was able to help you, Temari, though I don't think I did anything that great for you to help. He was interrupted as Temari put her fingers on his lips and smiled at him. Shush. You don't know how much you have helped Gaara and the village and me. Gaara respects you above all others, even more than a brother would, and you have great respect in the village for changing him for the better. She spoke softly and removed her fingers as his eyes watered. They respected him and admired him, and Gaara saw him as more than a brother there. Really? He whispered, and she nodded with a smile as a tear rolled down his eye, and she hugged him close to her, burying his face in her neck as she ran her fingers through his golden locks. Yes, really. Naruto came with me so you can live a good life there if you deserve it. She whispered as he broke off the hug and faced her with a sad smile, shaking his head. I can't. Temari-san is allied to the Leaf. I am not allowed in your village to even step foot in it, let alone live there. Even if the people acknowledge me, your cage won't be willing to tense the relations between the villages for someone as worthless as me. He said, his hair shadowing his eyes and tears dropping as she put a hand on his cheek and made him gaze into her eyes. You can come to Naruto, trust me. Do you know who the Goddamn Kazekage is? She asked softly, rubbing his cheeks with both her hands as she wiped his tears with her thumb, and he shook his head softly and she gave him a small smile as she gazed into his deep cerulean orbs that she noticed gave away his every emotion. He couldn't lie to her. Even if he wanted, his eyes would certainly give him away, she thought, gazing into those beautiful eyes that were shining with tears. Gaara became the Goddamn Kazekage 2 months ago. The council makes votes on his decisions since he is too young, but his word has a lot of weight in the village now, and the council would love to have a shinobi that is on par with my brother and isn't tied to any village, and neither is he a nuke. Nin. She spoke softly and she gazed into his tear-streaming eyes as she saw a spark of hope in the glint that they used to hold before returning. Really, do you think he will do that for me? And will your village accept me? There is the law of the Leaf Council too. He said, unsure of what to feel as she smiled at his nervousness. Naruto, Leaf and Sand are just neutral and can have good relations in the future because of the mutual betrayal of Orochimaru that we faced. But the fact that Konoha is still pushing for missions from our clients to make up for the losses is still straining the relationship, and I assure you that the law concerning you hasn't been accepted by Suna, otherwise Gaara would have found out and dismissed it. We didn't even know you were banished like that, or Gaara would have sent search parties for you and brought you under the care of the Sand Village. Trust me, Naruto, you will be accepted there. Believe me. She said softly, and he hugged her tightly, crying happily as he said in between sobs. I believe you, Temari. He said, and she smiled and rubbed his back and ran her fingers through his hair as he stopped crying and looked at her with tired and puffy red eyes and cheeks, and she thought his red cheeks with those whiskers made him look so cute shining in the moonlight as a yawn escaped. Both of them at the same time, and she giggled. Alright, let's sleep and stay in until late tomorrow, we could both use the rest. She said softly, and he nodded as both walked into the room, and Naruto started to walk up to the couch as she caught his wrist and looked at him with confusion. Where are you going? She asked, and he pointed at the couch, and she frowned. I'll sleep on the couch and you can have the bed. It'll be comfortable for you that way. He spoke in his soft voice, and she pulled on the bed with her, throwing him in the blanket as she went in and cuddled up to him. No, we can share the bed and I need something to hold on to. Be my pillow. She said, pouting, and wrapped her arms around him, putting her head on his chest as he brought her closer with his arm, and she buried her face in his neck, smiling at how warm he felt. Good night, Naruto. She said, yawning cutely. Good night, Temari. He whispered and closed his eyes as after many months he slept with a smile on his face. Next day. At noon. Temari woke up with a yawn as she gazed up at Naruto, who was wrapped with her and was sleeping peacefully, and smiled. She didn't understand why she felt so comfortable and safe to even sleep with him. She had never let her brothers even into her rooms before, let alone stay with her in the same bed. But he had such innocence in him that she couldn't feel an ounce of fear from him. She just couldn't believe that this frail and vulnerable boy with her was the same hyperactive knucklehead that she saw a few months back, and how broken and alone he was, and how his so-called friends had betrayed him. She put her hand on his cheek, rubbing his whiskers softly as he snuggled into her hand like a fox, and she giggled. Naruto, hearing and feeling the vibrations of her giggles, woke up and opened his eyes to see Temari playing with his whiskers and smiled a little at her. Morning, Temari. He whispered. Good morning, Naruto. She whispered back with a smile as a knock on the door was heard and she groaned inwardly and said. "Come in." She said as a waitress came in and blushed at seeing the two cuddling and Temari herself blushed at her implications. She glanced at Naruto who was looking at her innocently and she smiled, he didn't even understand what the waitress was staring at. I'm sorry I didn't mean to disturb you, but it is almost lunchtime and I was here to ask if you wanted something. She asked blushing and stuttering and Temari nodded not letting go of Naruto in the slightest. She was a proud Kunoichi and wasn't embarrassed by anything she thought, though the faint pink blush betrayed her doubts. "Yes, we'll have anything you recommend, alright," she said and the waitress nodded. "Well, the chicken pie with potato wedges is our speciality and would you like something cold to drink with it?" she asked, noting it down, and Temari smiled. "Yes, that would be great," she said as the waitress nodded and left, closing the door behind her. She saw Naruto with a hesitant expression and was confused. "What's wrong with Naruto?" she asked softly and he fiddled a bit more as she kept her hand on his face, keeping her gaze still on him as she looked at him curiously. Temari, I don't have any money so I won't be able to pay for anything anytime soon so you don't have to order for me," he said nervously and she smiled and nodded. "I know Naruto and you don't have to pay anything back to me, don't worry about it, alright. After all there are some perks to being related to two cages, she said mischievously and giggled and he too smiled in relief and nodded as she put her head back on his chest. An hour later the waitress came in with their food and they had freshened up and ate as she saw Naruto eating quickly and caught his wrist gently as she gave him a small smile. "Naruto eats a little slowly, you might choke on it otherwise and savor the taste, it will feel good, alright," she said softly and he looked down depressed and nodded. She was confused as he had stopped eating, thinking she had offended him and was about to apologize when he apologized first. "I'm sorry I've always eaten like that, In the orphanage before I was kicked out, if I didn't eat it quickly, then the other kids took it away from me and the matrons there would punish me for asking more, so I started eating like that. I thought that was how we were supposed to eat. I never really shared any meals with anyone other than the old man too and he never pointed it out. Guess he just didn't want to discourage me. No one told me it was wrong until today, I wondered why the girls at the academy would always berate my manners at eating, but now I know. Thank you," he said as a few tears dropped and Temari cursed herself for poking him too much, he was still too frail and not the same strong-willed ninja he was before. She had to keep that in mind and wiped away his tears with the sleeves of her kimono. She smiled reassuringly and spoke. "It's alright Naruto, it is not healthy for you to eat so fast. So eat a bit slowly, alright, it's better for you," she said and he nodded and ate slowly and she smiled as he was now savoring his meal and had an expression showing he loved the taste that he didn't concentrate on before. Both finished as she saw the time and that they could make it back to Suna in a couple of hours if they went fast and she knew the way around the deserts pretty well. She mused and turned to Naruto. She saw his clothes and frowned, she knew he had to get some clothes, but the village had way better stores than this village and he wouldn't get any shinobi-related equipment here either, plus she was out of money for now as the money she had brought was finished with the bills. She hadn't expected to stay in the village for more than a couple of hours, but Naruto was always one to change her life dramatically. She used to wear his worn-out sandals and walk beside her and they checked out of the inn and started jumping through the rooftops. It had been such a long time since he had done this and the breeze on his face and the rush of speed felt good again. "Hey Naruto, let's go back to the village. We'll make it there by 4 if we travel at a decent pace and I know all the shortcuts through the desert, alright," she said and he nodded with a small smile as they started running through the desert towards the sand village. They ran for a couple of hours as the walls of the village came into view. Sonegakure no Sato. Naruto and Temari walked through the village gates as Temari checked in herself and did it for Naruto as a civilian, since he was technically a civilian for now. They walked slowly through the streets towards the Kazekage Tower as Naruto looked around in amazement. He hadn't been to Suna before and had to admit it felt good to be back in a hidden village with all the shinobi he saw around. Many of the civilians were staring at him and the state of his clothes and the fact that he was walking with Temari and he looked down trying to avoid the stares and was now feeling conscious of his state of clothes as he walked with his head down, not wishing to see the stars. Temari saw it and scowled as she glared right back at them and they quickly turned around and went off to finish off their own work. They reached the main square of the village as the Kazekage Tower came into view. Kazekage Tower. Kazekage office. Gaara was in his office looking over at the paperwork that he had been assigned to do with the help of his secretary Mitsuri. The council wanted Gaara to have help to learn the ways of the village and how to look over village documents. But Gaara was annoyed at being stuck in the pile of paperwork. For a person who wasn't bound to anything his whole life and then suddenly stuck in a pile of paperwork was pretty difficult. His thoughts wandered around to his sister Temari. He had assigned a simple mission to her yesterday morning and she should have been back by late afternoon, but there wasn't any sign of her yet. He was getting worried and he hated this emotion that he had long since forgotten emerging. The fight with Naruto and his will to protect what was precious had changed him, and now he had become the Kazekage following in his footsteps. Ironically, he thought that he had basically fulfilled the dream that his brother had dreamed of for so long. His mind came back to Temari, and he figured if she didn't return by sunset, he would send scouting parties for her. He made the decision in his head. He returned to the bane of his life and started signing the evil papers. These papers had even better replication skills than Naruto did. He mused and got immersed in work. He was broken out of his thoughts as a knock came on his door and he and Mitsuri stopped their scribbling and looked up. He wondered who could be there at this time of the day. Maybe it was Temari, he mused. "Come in," he said monotonously as Temari stepped in, her fan slung on her back as she stepped in, and Gaara smiled a small smile. He was glad that she was alright. But he was stunned as another person he recognized all too well stepped in and his eyes widened. Blonde hair, cerulean blue eyes, whiskers and the orange clothes. There wasn't any doubt, but something was off about him. "Hi Gaara, it's been a long time," said Naruto in a small and frail voice, and he frowned a bit. The Naruto he knew was never this calm and soft-spoken. He gazed into his eyes and was stunned as they almost looked dead to him, compared to the shine and determination they once held that had inspired him once. He took a closer look at his attire, and his frown deepened. They were in tatters, stitched in several places and were barely hanging on, and his sandals looked too worn out. He saw that there was none of the happiness or the goofiness that he usually held, but the biggest change he saw was the lack of the leaf headband on his forehead. "Don't call Kazekage-sama by his common name, treat him with the respect he deserves," yelled Mitsuri as she saw he wasn't a ninja because of the lack of headband on him and was just a civilian disrespecting the Kazekage as Naruto took a step back, thinking he had offended them somehow. "I'm sorry Kazekage-sama," he said in a frail voice and looked down nervously, and now Gaara scowled. Something was wrong. He turned an angry gaze at Mitsuri who was scared from his look. He was rarely ever angry at her, emotionless yes, but now she saw he was livid and that he cared for the stranger too much. "Apologize and leave," he said monotonously and she instantly obliged as she turned to Naruto. "I apologize for my rudeness," she said quickly and rushed outside. Naruto said nothing and just stood nervously as Gaara stood up from his chair and walked up to him as he extended his hand for him to shake. Naruto saw the gesture and shook it gently. "It's indeed been a long time, my friend," he said and he nodded with a small smile. "Indeed it has Kazekage-sama," he said softly and Gaara frowned. "Please do not call me that. Formalities are unnecessary between us, Gaara is fine," he said and Naruto nodded as he turned to Temari, who was watching the interaction with a smile. Gaara rarely ever let anyone call him by his name other than her or Kankuro, for whom he insisted not to be formal ever. A simple gesture showed her how much he respected Naruto, and that made her happy. "Temari, you were supposed to return yesterday afternoon, were you ambushed?" he asked, thinking she had been ambushed and Naruto might have helped her and came here to drop her off safely. Temari shook her head and looked at her curiously. "No Gaara, the mission went as planned. Nothing unexpected happened," she said and he nodded but was even more confused now. "Then why were you a day and a half late?" he asked and she took a glance at Naruto who was looking down not meeting anyone's eyes and Gaara caught her glance and saw his gesture and was now getting impatient. But Temari spoke up. "Gaara, I had just finished my mission and was heading back to the village after having some lunch when I saw Naruto there and was confused as to what he was doing there and I followed him for a little while. I saw him there and got suspicious as to what he was doing and then." She spoke as she told Gaara everything and Gaara listened to every word with his full rapt attention. He didn't show any outward emotion, but on the inside the volcano of emotions he felt hearing her. Anger, hate, pain, betrayal, anguish, there weren't any negative emotions that he didn't feel and was almost considering heading to the gates of the Leaf Village and unleashing Shukaku there. He listened as Temari was on the verge of breaking down as he stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. "That's enough. I've heard all I needed to," he said and she nodded, rubbing off the tears that were threatening to spill as he turned to his brother who was still looking at his feet, his hair shadowing his eyes as he hadn't spoken a word to interrupt her. "Naruto, what Temari said, is it all true?" he asked, not believing all of this had happened without him getting the slightest wind of it. Naruto stood in the same position for a moment and Gaara thought he hadn't heard him and was about to say it again when his words were caught in his throat. Small drops started falling from Naruto's eyes as he cried silently and Gaara's eyes widened and he got all the answers he needed. Temari, seeing this, couldn't stand it and rushed in and embraced the blonde with her arms around his neck, bringing his face in her neck and held him tightly as he hugged her back. She held him tightly trying to take all his pain away and ran her finger through his golden locks. "Shh Naruto, it's alright, what's done is done, forget about, it's all in the past. I promised you everything will be fine, right? She whispered and he nodded in her neck as she broke off after a few minutes as he calmed down and Gaara stood there watching the interaction in disbelief. Sure, Temari respected him, but she never showed this soft side of her to anyone, not even to Kankuro and him. She would just scold them a bit and show them that she cared, but that was it. And the many guys who still pursued her as her fanboys, or any guys for that matter, wouldn't even get a second glance out of her. Gaara, though seeing the state his brother was in, didn't dwell on it for too long. As they broke off and stood close together with Temari holding and squeezing his hand for a bit to reassure him, and he smiled gratefully at her as they turned their gazes towards Gaara, who smiled a little sad smile at the blonde. I'm sorry, Naruto Uzumaki, I didn't know any of what transpired with you, or I would have taken steps to bring you in or help you in any way I could. Forgive me. He said and Naruto nodded, slowly giving him a small smile. It's alright, it isn't your fault, Gaara. He said and Gaara nodded as he continued. Now then, Naruto Uzumaki, I Gaara no Sabaku, Godin Kazukiage of Sunagakure no Sato, hereby offer you to be a part of the Suna Shinobi forces. Do you accept it? He said authoritatively and Naruto's eyes widened and his hands trembled and he glanced at Temari, who squeezed his hand and smiled and nodded. His eyes watered at both of their acceptance and he gave a shaky nod. Hi, I would love to. Arigato. He said in a shaky voice and Gaara too smiled and nodded as he went back to his desk and sat down on his chair as he took out a Suna headband from the drawer and walked back up to the blonde holding the headband in front him. Naruto teared up and put his heavily shaking hands in front of him and took a hold of the headband with his free hand. He ran a thumb across the shiny metal plate as a tear dropped on it and Temari took it gently from his hand and he didn't resist. She smiled at him and fastened his headband on his right bicep and hugged him. It looks great on you, Naruto. Congratulations. She whispered and he nodded. Arigato. He whispered and she too smiled and nodded. Gaara decided to let him know about the rest of the things. Naruto, since you are new to the village and don't have a place to stay, you will be staying with me and my family at the Sabaku estate. I will talk to the council tomorrow about your rank and status in the village, but I assure you, you will be given a respectable rank and will be an honorary Suna shinobi treated equally as any other in the village. He said and Naruto nodded. Gaara knew the council wouldn't mind a shinobi with the potential Naruto held out of their hands when they needed the strength to recover. Alright, Naruto, will I be correct in presuming that you haven't trained at all in the past 6 months? He asked and Naruto smiled a small smile and answered him. No, I have been learning a bit about seals, and since they are not flashy or anything, it was perfect to spend the time I was alone, but other than that I haven't used my chakra or had any form of training. I don't have the edge that I had a few months ago. I would ask if I could be placed on the reserve list for a little time. He said in his small voice and Gaara nodded. I'll take it up with the council tomorrow, but don't worry, even if you are on the active list I'll have you on simple missions until you are back to the strength that you find acceptable. I will take care of your monetary needs until you are fine to fend for yourself. He said and Naruto nodded gratefully. He didn't want to go on a mission and endanger anyone because he wasn't ready. Temari took this time to say what had been on her mind ever since she left the village. I would like my mission pay now if you don't mind. I want the money, there's something I need to do and I need some money or I'll have to go back to the estate to get some. She said and he nodded but was confused as to what was so urgent but decided not to question or pry into her business. He took out the mission scroll and put a stamp on it as he handed it to Temari and she took it. There's the mission scroll you were assigned. I have stamped and signed it, give it to Mitsuri on the way outside and she'll hand you the money. He said in his stoic voice and she nodded and took Naruto's hand, pulling him outside with her. He was confused where they were going but just went along with her. As they stepped outside, Temari walked over to Mitsuri's desk and handed her the scroll as she looked over it and took out the required money. Here you go, Temari-sama. She said and Temari took it with a smile as she walked out, pulling Naruto in tow, who just followed her. As they walked through the streets, quite a few of the people turned their heads to see Temari walking with a boy hand in hand. Naruto saw the looks and knew they were wondering what a girl like her was doing with someone like him. Temari, I don't think we should be holding hands, people are staring and it wouldn't look good for you to be seen holding hands with someone like me. He said in a quiet voice so that only Temari heard him as she stopped and looked at him with a blank face. I couldn't care less what those idiot gossipers think and I would be with you over any of them any day of the year. She set her hands on her hips and he nodded with a small smile as she took his hand and they started walking towards their destination. Temari didn't want to let go of his hand, it was big, rough and strong in her opinion, which wrapped her hand up completely and his hold was still so gentle that she felt safe. Ever since her mother no one had held her hand when walking and she liked the warmth that she felt holding his hand, though she won't admit it out loud. They walked through the shopping district and then came up to the busier parts of the village as they stopped in front of a shinobi equipment store. Temari ushered Naruto in, and he nodded and opened the door and went in first with Temari following in close behind. As he entered, his gaze wandered around the store as it had been a while since he had seen a shinobi store and he was transfixed by it. He walked over to the wall that held several weapons and glanced at the sword section as he walked over to the custom-made chakra metal kunai and his hand shot forward to touch it, but he pulled it back, it looked very expensive and he didn't want to offend the store owners. The man came up to him as he had seen him looking over the weapons and he had seen the way he looked at the kunai and woke up to him. His clothes were in pretty rough condition, so he guessed he was here to look over since he wouldn't be able to afford the pricing of his store since this was the best shinobi store in Suna. "Can I help you, young man? I'm afraid I don't think you'll be able to buy anything here. I don't mean to sound rude, but my store is quite expensive," he said politely, and Naruto nodded and smiled at the man who was surprised that he didn't mind what he said. "I know, sir, I don't have the money anyways, I was just looking at these, I'm sorry," he said, and the man nodded and gave him a smile at his politeness. He liked the kid but was intrigued by his eyes that showed him he had been through a lot. Temari came up after handing her fan at the counter for maintenance and saw Naruto talking to the store owner and caught the last part of the conversation. "Hideki, he's with me," she said, and the man turned to her surprised and smiled brightly. "Ah, Temari-sama, what can I help you with today?" he asked, and she smiled and pointed to Naruto. As you can see, Naruto here is in need of some clothes and equipment and he has just joined the village as a shinobi. "So I want some clothes and other equipment for him put on my account, alright," she said, and the man turned to Naruto surprised as his gaze turned to the headband on his bicep when he looked closely and he apologized to him as Naruto waved it off. Temari, this place is quite expensive, we should go somewhere cheaper, you know. You don't have to spend so much on me," he said softly out of the earshot of Temari, and Temari just put her fingers on his lips, quieting him down, and smiled at him. "Hush, don't worry about it, now let's go and get you something to look as good as me, alright?" she asked playfully and pulled him in the clothing section as Naruto saw that there were only bright colors in there and that the darker colors were quite rare. He guessed it was because of the climate there. He saw Temari going through clothes with a female attendant with a glint in her eyes and smiled a bit seeing her so happy. He decided to let her choose his clothing since he was well aware that his choices weren't the best and this was the first time he had been in a shinobi store and treated so nicely and not being ripped off. Temari saw him standing off in the side looking at her and grew confused as she walked up to him confused. "What's the matter, Naruto, why aren't you looking through the clothes, don't you like this store?" she asked, and he just shook his head. "No, I don't have a good choice with clothing, so I guess I'll go with your choice of clothing for now if that's alright," he asked, and she smiled brightly and nodded. "You just leave it all to me and I'll be back with the best clothes for you, alright?" she said, and he nodded as she hurried back with the attendant and was going through piles of clothing. He never knew Temari loved to shop so much, but he guessed it must be something all girls love. Finally, after an hour of searching, Temari returned with some clothing and pushed him in the changing room and he changed into what she had given him. As he came out, Temari's breath was caught in her throat as the attendant too was blushing like a tomato and staring at him. Naruto came out wearing a simple white t-shirt with a cut sleeves blue mesh underneath for protection that were showing his ripping muscles and sky blue baggy pants with lots of pockets for utilities. He was wearing the same sky blue colored shinobi sandals and sky blue fingerless gloves with metal back plates. She had chosen the color that was closest to his eyes to complement them and he grew nervous with their staring and fiddled around. The colors and the light airy materials would help him in the heat of the desert, she mused. Do you like it?" he asked nervously as both girls broke out of their stupors and Temari smiled and nodded and had a faint pink blush on her face and the attendant too nodded and stuttered out a yes. Who knew Naruto could look so nice with some nice clothes without orange, she thought as she picked up a new beige kunai holster and a white kunai pouch and some medical bandages to tie it up and to wrap it on his legs and forearms to protect them from the sun. She picked up 2 sets of standard kunai and shurikens and brought them to the counter. The shop owner came and noted everything down and nodded, saying he would send the 4 separate sets of clothing to his home and Temari said to deliver it to the Sabaku estate. The man was shocked but nodded and asked for any customizations and Naruto asked for a pen and paper. The man nodded and handed it to him as Naruto drew the Uzumaki spiral and the Namikaze symbol of a lightning bolt in a circle and asked for them to be stitched on the sleeves and the man nodded as he asked for his shirt and got it done in 15 minutes, handing it to him and said he would have it done to the rest too. Naruto thanked the man and Temari and both smiled. Sonegakure no Sato. Temari was pulling Naruto through the streets and many more of the heads of the villagers were turning as they were surprised to see the princess of Suna pulling a blonde shinobi whom none of them recognized but saw the Suna headband and were confused. Many girls were looking at Naruto and blushing and then whispering amongst themselves while the guys were looking on in jealousy. Naruto was nervous since it did remind him of the stairs back in Konoha, but he reminded himself that this wasn't his birth village now. They walked towards the clan grounds of the village and then to a really large estate. Temari took Naruto in the house as he marveled at the great house and was amazed that it was only for 3 people. "Alright Naruto, this is my house and now yours for the time being. Let me show you around, alright," she said, and he nodded, following her around as she showed him a large living room and then took him into the large dining room that was attached to the kitchen. She then took him to the first floor, and as they climbed up the stairs, they came to a hallway as Naruto saw many rooms down the hall, and Temari spoke up, pulling him into a room with a king-size bed, a big closet, a dressing table with a huge shelf besides it, and an attached bathroom. He was transfixed that he was going to live here. It was as big as his old apartment in the Leaf, he mused. "And Naruto, this is your room, the room beside you is Kankuro's, and the one in front of his is Gaara's, while mine is at the end of the hallway to the left." She chirped happily, and he nodded with a small smile as he and Temari started walking down towards the living room as Naruto sat down on the armchair while Temari plopped down face first on the cushion over the couch. "Man, I wish we could have something to eat just now. The restaurant takes 2 hours to deliver and I hate to eat there with all the people staring at me all the time," she murmured in the pillow as Naruto smiled a little. "Then maybe I could make you something?" he asked softly, and she looked at him surprised with a raised eyebrow. "You could cook?" she asked in a surprised voice, and he nodded, getting up and walking into the kitchen as Temari sat on the stool beside the counter as Naruto started to pull out a pan, knife and the ingredients that were available. She watched surprised as he washed his hands and then the vegetables and then started cutting them like a professional. He tossed a piece of steak that he found in the fridge into the frying pan as he started to make a sauce to go over it in the other. As soon as the aroma began to spread, Temari's stomach growled and Naruto turned to her and smiled as she blushed in embarrassment. "Wow, you really know how to cook. I can tell from just the smell. The only one that could cook amongst us is Kankuro, and that too is just average," she said as she remembered the few times he cooked and it didn't leave a good taste to remember ever, so she always preferred to order food home. "Here you go," he said, keeping the plate in front of her as he sat in front of her, pulling a stool himself and sat down in front of her. Temari looked at her plate and the smell was just amazing as she took a fork and cut a piece as she put it in her mouth and her eyes shot open as her mouth exploded with flavors. She immediately dug in for some more, smiling as Naruto saw her and smiled a bit that she liked it and ate slowly himself. Am had taught him how to cook, though he always ate at the stand as it gave him company and he didn't like always eating alone. As Temari finished and cleaned her plate, she sighed in relief as she turned to Naruto with a smile. "You're a great cook, Naruto. This beats the hell out of that restaurant's food any day," she said happily, and he smiled as he picked up the plates and went to wash them as Temari leaned against the counter beside him. "I'm glad you like it. I can make you dinner every night if you'd like it, it's the least I could do," he said, and she beamed. Eating food like that every day was heaven. "That would be great, Naruto, now I don't have to eat Kankuro's bland dishes anymore," she said, scrunching up her nose, and Naruto laughed a little at her expression and she smiled. His laugh was soft, but at least he was coming out a little. Naruto himself felt good, it had been a long time since he had laughed. "You should laugh and smile more, Naruto, it suits you better," she said softly, and he smiled a bit. "Yeah, maybe I might have some things to be happy about here," he whispered, and she smiled and nodded. Both went into their rooms as they changed for the night and went to bed. Midnight. Temari was trying to sleep and was hugging her bear but was missing the warmth of Naruto as she wrapped her legs around the bear, hugging it tightly to her chest as she scrunched her eyes, but the sleep wouldn't come to her eyes. She was sleeping in just her t-shirt and her white cotton panties. She didn't like to be in much clothes, but she was annoyed that she couldn't sleep now. She turned around a couple of times in her bed, but the sleep just won't come. She got up and decided to get some water. As she passed by Naruto's room, she heard sniffing and she stopped dead in her tracks. She opened the room of his door with a click and went in as she came close to Naruto's bed to see him trembling and crying in his sleep as she sat down beside him and put her hand on his forehead and ran her fingers through his hair as his trembling calmed down a little. "Shh Naruto, it's alright. Sleep," she whispered softly as she laid down beside him when he suddenly wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close to him. She let out a small eep and was blushing because of the clothes both were wearing. He was in his boxers and a t-shirt and she too wasn't faring well. But she loved the warmth that he emitted and wrapped her arms around his waist slowly and softly and put her face in the crook of his neck as she closed her eyes, and Naruto calmed down and fell into a deep slumber. She too fell asleep from his slight breathing with a small smile. Morning. Temari woke up from a deep sleep that took all of her stress of the constant mission she had been on away. She felt two arms wrapped around her waist and something hard but still warm on her back, and then she felt the face of Naruto buried in the back of her neck and blushed as memories of last night came back, and she tried to scoot out of his grip to avoid the embarrassing position Naruto would wake up in, but he pulled her closer and buried his face in the back of neck a bit more as her blush intensified. She decided to sleep a bit more and closed her eyes and got comfortable and prepared for the embarrassment to come. Downstairs, an exhausted Gaara and Kankuro came in and sat down on the couch. "Man, that mission was tiring, I hate border security," whined Kankuro, and Gaara nodded. He didn't have the same problem as Kankuro since he didn't sleep, only mediated, but last night he had to do some official paperwork that was to be sent in the morning, and he too was exhausted. "Hey, where's Temari? She's usually up and about now." Kankuro and Gaara nodded, wondering the same thing. "Yes, she must be sleeping in," he said monotonously, and Kankuro got up and walked towards the stairs. "Alright, I'll wake her up, make us some breakfast and then sleep," he said, and Gaara nodded. He followed him as he too had to get something in his room. Kankuro walked to Temari's room and knocked as he got no answer. He knocked again a couple of times and called her but got no answer. Gaara walked out of his room and saw him standing on her door. "What's wrong?" he asked stoically, and Kankuro turned around. "Temari isn't answering the door, should we? Go in?" he asked nervously, and Gaara went in deep thought for a moment. Temari didn't like anyone coming into her room, especially in the morning, and would chase them to death. But he had his sand and was safe. But Kankuro. "Yes, we should," he said, and Kankuro nodded and opened the door as both peeked in to see the room empty and grew confused. Then an idea came to Gaara's mind. Naruto was living here too. He must be in the guest room and know where she was since he was the last one to meet her. "Kankuro, I have an idea," he said, and walked towards the guest room with Kankuro in tow, who was confused but shrugged and followed as Gaara opened and entered the room, and Kankuro behind him, and stopped dead in their tracks as they saw Temari, but were shocked as they saw her snuggled with Naruto. Kankuro's jaw dropped to the ground and started muttering incoherent words, pointing his index finger at the blondes in bed as Gaara's eyes too were wide for a few moments. Temari was sleeping with her back against his chest as he had pulled her closer with his arms wrapped around her waist and his face buried in her flowing blonde hair. Temari, hearing Kankuro's babbling, fluttered her eyes open and saw her brothers standing there and expressions of disbelief on their faces, and she blushed a faint pink blush with the position she was in. She turned around in his arms and put her hand on his cheek, tapping it lightly. "Naruto woke up," she whispered softly, and he snuggled into her neck. She blushed a deep crimson and was glad her face wasn't visible to her brothers. Smells nice," he muttered and went back to sleep. Now Kankuro was pale as a sheet as he knew Temari was going to kill him and prayed for the blonde's afterlife to be good. Gaara too was worried for his friend as he knew how Temari reacted to someone who got in with her in the same room, let alone the same bed, even if by accident. He had to save Kankuro the last time he tried to wake her up and was beaten to near death as Temari assumed he was a pervert without even giving him a chance to explain and had gotten the beating of his life. "Naruto, wake up please," she whispered softly again as Naruto's eyes fluttered open and he gazed into Temari's beautiful teal green eyes and saw that she was a bit red in the face. "Temari, what are you doing here? And why are you so red? Are you sick?" he asked sleepily and put his forehead against hers to check her temperature and saw that she was a bit hot. All the blood in Temari's body rushed to her face as she gazed into his cerulean orbs that were looking at her with concern. "Temari, you should stay in bed today, I'll make you something to eat. You look a bit sick," he said in concern, and Temari saw his innocence and all doubts in her mind vanished about him trying something with her. "What are you doing here anyways, Temari?" he asked, and she smiled though still had a faint pink blush on her face. "I walked past your room last night and you were trembling and crying in sleep from a nightmare. So I rubbed your head to calm you down, but you pulled me close in your sleep," she whispered, and he nodded. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and she shook her head. "It's alright, you were in your sleep and I came into your room, so it's alright," she whispered, and he nodded, letting her loose as both sat up. "I'll go make some breakfast, you get fresh alright," he said, and she nodded as he stood up and saw Gaara and Kankuro standing there with stupefied looks on their faces. He smiled a bit as he walked past them. "Morning, Gaara, Kankuro," he said, walking past but got no answer and thought they were a bit sleepy and walked down the stairs. Temari saw their faces and after a few moments Gaara broke out of his stupor. "I approve," he said monotonously, pulling Kankuro out by the collar of his cat suit as Temari's blush returned full force at the insinuation as Gaara closed the door and she stood up and went to her room to get some shorts as she too headed down after getting her face washed. She walked down the stairs as again a wonderful aroma hit her nose and she walked into the kitchen and saw Gaara, who was staring at Naruto while Kankuro was drooling from the smell, and she looked at him in disgust. "Close your mouth, Kankuro, I will be getting the first plate anyways," she said as Kankuro glared at her. "And who said that?" he retorted, and Temari smiled a little too sweetly at him. "I did. You have a problem with that?" she asked sweetly, and he gulped and shook his head as she sat down with a smile. It was great to not eat Kankuro's disgusting miso soup and rice in the morning, she thought, as Naruto kept 2 plates with fried eggs, caramelized bacon, toasts and milk as she snatched one plate while Kankuro went for the other, but San took it before he could get his hands on it. "Hey, that's not fair," he yelled indignantly, pointing a finger at Gaara, who ignored his rant and took a bite as he spoke. "We are shinobi. Nothing we do is fair," he said stoically while Kankuro fumed. He turned around feeling a tap on his shoulder as he saw Naruto handing him a plate, and he took it with a smile. Temari dug into her plate and her tongue was in heaven. It had been the last great couple of meals, she had to admit, and he was a damn good cook. "Naruto, you are a great cook, and this is 1,000 times better than that stuff Kankuro cooks and calls food," she said, eating happily as Naruto sat in front of her with a smile and ate. "Indeed," said Gaara and kept eating. "Hey," yelled Kankuro as Temari giggled at their antics and saw Naruto eating his food slowly, not interested in their conversation, and smiled sadly as she too concentrated on eating. Kankuro had been told about Naruto by Gaara when he went to report his mission, so he didn't want to probe the troubled blonde too much and decided to stay quiet. Naruto finished his breakfast at the same time as Temari as he took her plate. She tried to protest, but he took it anyway and went to the sink to clean them up. Temari followed him to the kitchen as Gaara and Kankuro were left alone. "She's different around him," suddenly Kankuro said, and Gaara nodded. "She is. And I approve if they get close. Naruto is better than any of the people in the village after Temari, and I trust him with her, and I know Temari won't do anything to break his heart or betray him. She is too strong-willed for that, they are good with each other, and I would like it if they got together," he said, and Kankuro was surprised. Gaara was protective of Temari and had scared many guys who tried to approach her due to her status away, and if he approved of Naruto, then that was good since he himself trusted the blonde. And from what he saw in the morning, there was a chance they could get together, he mused. He wanted to tease Temari about it but knew better than to aggravate her and be at the receiving end of her battle fan. In the kitchen, Naruto was going through the dishes that were used for cooking and the ones he and Temari used as Temari was drying them off, and she decided to ask him something to start up a conversation. "So Naruto, what have you planned for the day?" she asked curiously, and he thought for a moment and replied. "I'll start my training today. Get my body up to speed and work on my taijutsu. Then meet up with Gaara in the afternoon for my registration and get whatever rank I'm given," he said, and she nodded happily that he was going to get back in shape. She knew the kind of a ninja he could be and how he lashed back to protect someone when backed up into a corner, as she had witnessed it firsthand, and was glad he was as soon a shinobi now. "If you want any help or a sparring partner, I'll help you, alright," she said, and he nodded gratefully. "Thank you, but for now I'll have to train myself back to the way I was and then surpass the strength I had. I had many weaknesses in the past that I have had a lot of time alone to think about from the experiences of my previous battles. I'll work up those skills too and not rely on Kyuubi's chakra any longer," he said softly but with a bit of determination in his voice, and Temari smiled at seeing the spark reignite within him. "Alright, tell me when you are ready. I'm looking forward to that spar," she said, grinning, and he smiled a bit and nodded as he finished and washed his hands as he went to his room to get ready. He showered and changed into the clothes that Temari bought for him yesterday and unsealed the wooden box his parents had left him and picked up the lid as he gazed at the scrolls in it. He had just read some of the books that were sealed in a scroll by his mother from the Uzumaki clan, but he didn't ever look into all the scrolls his father left him or the scrolls on the adamantine chains and that his mother left him, since he believed his days as a shinobi were over. But now was the time to open them, he mused as he picked up a scroll on his father's taijutsu style, the hummingbird style, used with the speed and agility with quick blows that all the Namikaze clan members were naturally entwined to. He always wondered how he was so quick that he could outrun the Konoha Anbu after his pranks when the old man sent them to catch him, but he used to run them to the ground for hours before the old man himself or Iruka-sensei would catch him. His heart ached as he thought of his deceased grandfather and how much he fought for him against the council for him. The only one to care when he was a child was whether he lived or not, and he knew that the monthly stipend that he got after he was kicked out from the orphanage was from his personal accounts, since the council would never approve a monthly stipend for him. He walked into a training field at the estate and found a stump nearby to practice his katas on as he read the exercises and stretches written on the scroll and started going through them. He read through the basic katas and started going through them for a couple of hours when he was finally convinced he had done enough exercises till noon and went through the katas until lunchtime. Hazakage Tower. Council Chambers. The council structure of Suna was very different from that of the council that Konoha had. Where Konoha had a shinobi council, a civilian council and an advisory of the elder council of the Hokage. Suna used a council composed of 10 people, all high-ranking shinobis of the village or war veterans, with plenty of experience and wisdom. Gaara came in through the door as the Anbu guarding him closed the door and vanished into the walls. Gaara sat at his seat on the round table as everyone started wondering why he had called an urgent meeting. Gaara, seeing their confusion, decided to explain. As all of you must be wondering why I have called you here, I'll get straight to the point. He said, and everyone nodded. They knew he liked to talk directly to the point and they respected that aspect of his not beating around the bush. You all must be aware who Naruto Uzumaki is, I presume? He asked, and they all nodded, knowing the guy who defeated Gaara in the Sand Sound invasion on the Leaf and their most promising genin, as their reports had said after the invasion. Naruto Uzumaki was banished from Konoha 6 months ago and the council there ordered all of its allies that if he stepped foot in their territory, he was bound for execution. He said as the council became deathly silent until Baki spoke up. Why would they do that? He was one of their promising and loyal genin if what we saw in the exams was any indication. What did he do? He asked, and Gaara nodded, agreeing with his assessment. He captured Sasuke Uchiha when he turned on the village to leave for Orochimaru, but the battle caused the Uchiha many injuries, for which the council decided to take out its hate on him being the of the Nine Tails by banishing him. All of his friends and teachers turned on him, reading the false report of the Uchiha, and the presence of the Bijuu's chakra only solidified their false assumptions. He spoke calmly and whispers broke out. Those fools, we should look for the boy who could become a shinobi of the Sand Village, and the whole village respects him already, and he even spared Kazuki Ijzama during the invasion, and you respect him as a brother, as I've heard. Another councilman said, and Gaara smirked. Looks like it won't be as hard as he had presumed. He could be a strong shinobi for our village, and his loyalty is unquestioned according to reports, and we have no such orders from the Leaf Village, and neither have we signed any strong mutual treaty with the village yet due to their unreasonable demands. Gio said, and Gaara nodded and smiled as all the councilmen were curious why he was smiling. There is no need for us to find him. He said, crossing his fingers in front of his mouth and closing his eyes as the whole council protested and shouted, but he cut them off. Because he is already in the village. He said as the whole room turned deathly silent and curious looks were sent at the Kazuki. Temari found him in a small village near the Sand Village and convinced him to come here. I've already assigned him to the roster and given him his headband, and the only thing left to do is to assign him a suitable rank, for which I am here for your recommendations. He said stoically, and they all murmured amongst themselves before Ibizo spoke up. After his performance in the exams and in the invasion, I say for now is a suitable rank, if I may suggest Kazuki Ijzama. He said, and the whole council agreed, and Gaara too nodded with a smile. Then Naruto Uzumaki is hereby granted the rank of. He said, and they all nodded with a smile. I have decided to put him on the reserved list for the time being, as was his request to me. He said, and they were confused and waited to hear his reasons. He hasn't used chakra and hasn't trained in the past 6 months to hide himself completely from the enemies that would have chased after him and has lost his edge. He has requested for an indefinite training time until he finds himself back to his strength for training. And I agree with him. Does the council agree? He asked, and they all nodded. It made sense, and he would only get stronger if he trained nicely. Then the council is dismissed. He said, and they all left with smiles on their faces at the new addition in their shinobi forces. Gaara was glad they saw reason, and him being a that had a completely stable seal only warranted the council to trust and respect him more. And add to that the fact that he was completely free, he was waiting to be taken in. He was only sad that he didn't find him earlier. Hazukage Tower. Hazukage office. Gaara was going through the documents and mission scrolls when a knock was heard, and he knew who it was. He had been waiting for his friend. Come in. He said, and in walked the mop of sun-kissed blonde hair, and his eyes went wide. He had to say that Temari wasn't wrong when she said he looked great in his shinobi outfit. The two had to admit he looked like a serious shinobi in those clothes, and the scratches he had on his skin and the little dust on his clothes was clear indication that he had been training hard, and his posture was now a bit straighter than yesterday. He noticed and motioned for him to take a seat. Knowing he would be tired a bit. Naruto, the council has made its decision and has agreed to accept you as a shinobi of the Sand Village by unanimous voting in your favor and come to a decision on your rank. After seeing your performance at the exams and in the invasion, you are hereby promoted to the rank of. He said, handing him a light beige-colored vest that he took with a small smile, and his eyes watered. He was nervous that the council might not accept him, but now all his doubts had been blown away. He wiped his eyes and thanked him, and Gaara nodded, taking out a form. Naruto, here is your registration form. You must know what all you need to fill. Name, clan status, rank, parents, and a signature to pledge your allegiance to Tsunagakure no Sado. There's no need for a photograph. I have one already that was taken when you were training, so you won't have to waste time with it. He said, and he nodded, taking it and started filling out all the details truthfully. He handed it back to Gaara, his eyes widened as he dropped the paper from shock and pulled out an old bingo book and opened up 2 pages and looked at him, then back at the book and then again at him and sighed. I can't believe no one in your village has noticed it until now in all these years. I myself feel stupid for not noticing it. Do you wish to tell the village? He asked and Naruto shook his head with a small smile, glad he didn't doubt his claim. No, I'm not ready to defend myself if someone comes after me. Maybe when I'm a bit stronger, I don't care for fame either. I just want to take up my father's name. He said and Gaara smiled sadly. You could have hidden it from me until you were ready. Why did you tell me then? He asked and Naruto smiled a small smile. You're my cage now. I am loyal to the village, but first and foremost to you, I won't lie to you. He said and Gaara smiled. His loyalty to the village was unquestionable, and this was the proof. Very well, this registration form will be misplaced for the time being until you are ready to reveal it. I am glad you trust me with this, and one more thing, your request to be put on the reserved roster has been approved. You'll be reinstated when I feel you're ready or you request yourself. Here is your monthly stipend, you'll get it from me personally until you are back on missions. He calmly handed him the envelope and Naruto took it gratefully. Gaara didn't want to tell him it was from him and not from the village, as he didn't want him to waste his time on D ranks for money and he had plenty from the Sabaku fortune. Arigato Gaara. He said and Gaara nodded as he turned to leave and Gaara spoke up. Naruto, what do you think of Temari? He asked as Naruto stopped holding the knob to the door as he turned his head to show his one visible eye deadly serious. He didn't understand why he asked that, but he would answer him nonetheless. My life belongs to her, I would have died had she not pulled me out of my dark time. She is probably the only one I keep above this village and you. He said and Gaara nodded as he opened the door and left. A smirk found its way on Gaara's lips as he started going through the documents again.